The first thing Tobias Sullivan saw when he stepped out onto his porch that cold October morning in 1874 was a woman standing at the edge of his land with nothing but a carpet bag, a split lip, and the kind of eyes that made a man forget every sensible thought he had ever possessed. He stood there for a long moment, coffee mug halfway to his mouth, the steam curling up and disappearing into the sharp Montana air, and he told himself he was imagining it. There were no women at the edge of his land. There had not been a woman anywhere near the Sullivan homestead in going on 3 years, not since his mother had passed and his sister had married and moved east to Helena. He was a man alone in every sense of the word, and he had made his peace with that the way a man makes peace with a stone in his boot. You acknowledge it is there, you acknowledge it hurts, and you walk anyway. But the woman did not disappear when he blinked. She was standing at the fence line, the rough-cut post and rail he had hammered in himself 2 summers past, and she was looking out at the mountains the way people look at things when they are not really seeing them at all. She was seeing something else, something behind her own eyes, and whatever it was had left her standing alone in the frost-stiff grass of a stranger's property at half-past 6 in the morning with a split lip and no horse. Tobias set his coffee down on the porch rail and came down the steps. He was 31 years old that autumn, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from real work rather than vanity, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a proper razor in 4 days. He had built this ranch from a promise his father made and never kept, and he had done it the hard way, which was the only way he knew. He was not, by any reasonable assessment, a man given to impulse or sentiment. He was careful, methodical, and deeply private, and his nearest neighbor, old Caleb Dre, had once said that Tobias Sullivan was the kind of man who could stand in the middle of a thunderstorm and make the thunder feel like it was the one out of place. He walked down the long slope of the front pasture toward the fence line, and the woman heard him coming. She turned, and he saw the whole picture in one instant. The carpet bag dropped in the grass at her feet, the dark wool coat that was good quality once but now showed hard travel, the auburn hair that had come half undone from its pins, and the left side of her face where her lip was swollen and there was a bruise beginning to darken along her cheekbone. She did not flinch when she saw him coming. That was the first thing he noticed and filed away as significant. A woman who had been hurt and was standing alone on a stranger's land in the early morning light would most often flinch or step back at the sight of a man walking toward her. This one squared her shoulders instead. "This is private land," Tobias said. He said it evenly, not unkindly, because those were just the facts. "I know it," the woman said. Her voice was steady, though it had something underneath it that was working hard to stay that way. "I apologize for being here. I did not know where else to go." Tobias stopped a few feet from the fence and looked at her properly. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with green eyes that were clear despite everything else, and she was holding herself very still the way a person holds themselves when they are in pain and do not want anyone to know it. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I am well enough," she said. "That is not what I asked." She looked at him for a moment and something shifted in her expression just slightly. "My name is Rebecca Norris," she said. "I arrived in Beaumont Creek on the stage from Billings 3 days ago. I was meant to be married to a man named Howard Vane." She paused. "I will not be marrying Howard Vane." Tobias had heard of Howard Vane. Most people in this part of Montana had heard of Howard Vane. He was the kind of man people heard of in the way you hear thunder before you see the lightning, always as a warning. He owned the Vane Cattle Company, which was the largest operation in the county, and he was known for 2 things, making money and having a temper that he did not trouble himself to control. "He did that to your face?" Tobias asked. Rebecca Norris said nothing, which was its own answer. Tobias looked out across the pasture for a moment, then back at her. Every sensible instinct he had said to be careful. A woman who had been promised to Howard Vane and had run from him was a woman with trouble attached to her like a shadow, and trouble involving Howard Vane had a way of spreading to everyone around it. He knew that. He understood it the way you understand the weight of a coming storm. "Come up to the house," he said. "You can eat something and get warm." Rebecca Norris picked up her carpet bag. "I do not want to be a burden to you. You are standing in the frost in a field," Tobias said. "Come up to the house." She came through the gate he opened for her, and they walked up the slope together without speaking, and Tobias told himself that he would feed her and let her rest and then figure out what to do, and that was all. That was as far as he intended to think. He did not yet know that thinking was about to become entirely beside the point. The kitchen of the Sullivan homestead was the warmest room in the house, which Tobias had built himself over 4 years of mornings and evenings after the rest of the work was done. The house was not grand, but it was solid, with thick log walls and a stone fireplace in the main room, and a cast iron stove in the kitchen that he kept fed all autumn and winter long. He had a table with 4 chairs, though he only ever used one, and a shelf of books along the wall beside the window, because he believed a man without books was a man who had stopped asking questions, and questions were the only thing that kept you honest. He put water on to boil and cut bread and found the last of the salt pork from the week before, and Rebecca Norris sat at his table and did not speak. She held her hands in her lap and looked at them, and Tobias moved around the kitchen and let her have the silence because he understood that some silences are not emptiness but are instead the sound of a person putting themselves back together. "There is a pump in the back room," he said after a while. "Cold water, but it will help with the swelling." She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, and then quietly, "Why are you being kind to me?" The question surprised him, though it probably should not have. "Because you needed somewhere to be," he said simply. "That seems like a sufficient reason." She went to the back room and he heard the pump working, and he finished making the food and poured coffee into 2 mugs, and when she came back her hair was properly pinned and she had washed her face, and she looked less like a woman at the edge of disaster, and more like a woman who had passed through something, and was assessing the distance she had covered. She sat down and ate with the careful manners of a woman who had been raised to have them, and she drank the coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug, and after a little while she said, "I was a school teacher in Missouri, Beaumont County near the border. My father died in January and left debts I could not pay on a teacher's income, and a man named Elias Purdy who ran the boarding house said he knew of a cattle rancher in Montana who was looking for a wife. A good man," he said, "established, respectable." "Purdy is Vane's cousin," Tobias said. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. "I worked that out on the 3rd day," she said. "After." Tobias said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that would help. The arrangement she was describing was not uncommon in 1874 in the territories, and the misuse of it was not uncommon either. Women came west for a dozen reasons: opportunity, escape, hope, necessity, and the men who waited for them were not always the men they had been advertised to be. The law did not have a great deal to say about it, and the land did not care either way. "How did you get away?" he asked. "He left for town the morning after I arrived," she said. "I waited an hour and then I walked." "You walked from the Vane spread. That is 14 miles. 15, I think," she said. "I counted fence posts." Tobias looked at her for a moment and felt something shift in his chest, some quiet, internal rearrangement of the furniture, and he recognized it as the kind of feeling that was inconvenient and would bear watching. He looked away. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "I have $7.40. I need to get to a town large enough to have a school that needs a teacher, or work of some kind, something respectable." She looked at him directly. "I am not asking you to solve my problem. I am only asking for a day to rest before I figure out how to solve it myself." "You can stay here," he said. The words came out before he had finished deciding to say them, and he could feel the surprise of them in his own mouth. He cleared his throat. "There is the storage room off the back. It has a cot and a window. It is clean. You can stay until you have worked out your next step." Rebecca Norris looked at him carefully. "That is a very generous offer from someone who does not know me." "It is a practical one," Tobias said. "Howard Vane is going to come looking for you. When he does, it would be better if you were not on the road alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you not afraid of Howard Vane?" Tobias picked up his coffee mug. "I am afraid of very few things," he said. "Howard Vane is not one of them." That was not entirely bravado. The Sullivan land shared a boundary with the Vane Cattle Company's easternmost pasture, and the two men had been in quiet dispute over that boundary for 2 years. Tobias knew Howard Vane's methods, and he had stood against them with nothing more than clear property records and a stubbornness that he had inherited from a line of Sullivans who believed that a man's land was a man's land, period, and no amount of money or menace changed that. Rebecca stayed. He showed her the back room, which was small but had a real window that looked out at the mountains and a shelf where he had put an extra blanket and a pitcher for washing. She stood in the doorway and looked around it with the expression of someone who had been expecting less and was quietly relieved. "It is perfect," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Tobias," he said. She looked at him. "Rebecca," she said, and so it began. The first week was careful and quiet, the way two people are when they are learning the shape of each other's presence. Tobias went about his work, which in late October meant reinforcing the barn against the coming winter, checking the cattle, cutting wood, and maintaining the endless list of small repairs that a homestead required. Rebecca, without asking, began to make herself useful in the way that a person who is uncomfortable with idleness always does. She cooked, which she turned out to be considerably better at than Tobias, who had survived for 3 years on a limited rotation of things he could make without thinking too hard about them. She mended things. She cleaned. She organized the kitchen shelves in a way that made everything easier to find, and when Tobias noticed and said so, she looked mildly pleased and immediately changed the subject. On the third day, she asked if she could use his books. "They are there to be used," he said. She read in the evenings, sitting near the fire in the main room while Tobias did his accounts at the table, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of two strangers being careful. It was the silence of two people who had discovered that the other's presence was not an intrusion. On the 5th day, Howard Vane came. Tobias saw the riders from the barn, 2 men with Vane, both of them wearing the kind of expression that men wear when they have been sent to collect something they consider already theirs. Tobias came out of the barn unhurried, carrying his work gloves, and met them in the yard. Howard Vane was 43 years old, thick through the middle now, with a reddish face and small eyes that had the particular look of a man who had learned early that enough money meant enough power and had never questioned that equation. He sat his horse with the easy arrogance of a man who owned a great deal of the world he could see. "Sullivan," he said, by way of greeting. "Vane," Tobias replied in the same tone. "I am looking for a woman. She would have come through here or nearby, thereabouts 4 or 5 days ago. Auburn hair, green eyes, traveling with a carpet bag." "I have not seen anyone matching that description," Tobias said. Which was technically true. He had not seen her traveling. He had seen her standing still. Vane's small eyes moved across the yard to the house and back again. "She is my promised wife," he said. "She got herself confused and ran off before we had a chance to get properly acquainted. I am concerned for her safety in this kind of country." "That is very thoughtful of you," Tobias said. "If you see her, I expect you will send word." "If I see a woman in distress," Tobias said carefully, "I will see to it that she is safe." Vane held his gaze for a moment, and something moved behind those small eyes that was not friendly and not confused. "You are a man who likes to parse words, Sullivan." "I'm a man who likes to be precise," Tobias said. Vane looked at the house one more time. Then he turned his horse and his riders turned with him and they rode back toward the road, and Tobias stood in the yard and watched them go and let out a slow breath through his nose. He went back into the house. Rebecca was standing in the kitchen doorway, pale and very still. "He will come back," Tobias said. "He knows." "What do we do?" she asked. Tobias hung his gloves on the hook by the door and turned to face her. "We do nothing differently," he said. "You are a guest in my home. That is all he can say or prove. The law does not require a woman to marry a man she has not married, and it does not require her to go back to him. The law in this county runs very close to Howard Vane's pockets, Rebecca said. It does, Tobias agreed. But I know Sheriff Aldane, and Aldane is a fair man, whatever else. He will not drag a woman out of a house against her will without cause. Rebecca pressed her lips together and nodded slowly. Then she said, "You lied to him for me." "I was imprecise," Tobias said. She almost smiled. It was the first time he had seen anything close to it, and it did something to his chest that he chose, for the moment, to ignore. The days moved forward with the particular beauty and harshness that is only available in Montana in late autumn. The sky went colors at sunset that seemed almost unreasonable, deep rose and burning orange, and a purple that settled into the mountains like something poured from a great height. The mornings were cold with a sharpness that cut through everything and made the world feel very real and very close. The cattle needed moving, and the wood pile needed building, and there was always work. And Rebecca moved through all of it with a competence and a steadiness that Tobias found himself watching when he thought she was not looking. She had a habit of tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking hard about something. She drank her coffee strong and did not put sugar in it. She sang to herself very quietly when she was doing dishes, old songs, the kind his mother used to sing, and she stopped every time she realized he was near enough to hear, and he never said anything because he did not want her to stop. On the 8th day, she came out to the barn in the late afternoon, while he was working on the fence line repairs he had brought in from the pasture, and she stood in the barn door with her coat buttoned and her breath making small clouds in the air, and she said, "Can I help?" "You do not have to," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said. "I am asking if I can." He showed her how to hold the boards, and she held them, and they worked side by side until the light got too thin to work by, and they talked, really talked, for the first time about things that mattered and things that did not. She told him about teaching school in Missouri, the children's faces when something clicked into understanding, the way the youngest ones would write their letters with their whole body involved, their tongues pressing against their teeth with the effort of it. He told her about building the house, about the first winter when the roof had not been finished and he had slept under canvas for 3 months because he had run out of materials and out of money, and it had been a matter of finishing or giving up. She asked him why he had not given up. "Because it was mine," he said. "Because my father said this land was for the family, and then he left the family, and I decided that I would be the one who stayed." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "What happened to him, your father?" "He went to California in '62 when the Silver News came out of Nevada. We never heard from him again." "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be," he said. He was not a man worth being sorry for. She looked at him then in the way that people look when they recognize something in another person that matches something in themselves. "My father was present for all of it," she said. "Every day of my life he was there. He just could never manage the money. He meant well, but meaning well does not pay debts." She paused. "I used to be angry about it. Now I think I mostly just understand it." "Understanding it does not mean you have to stop being angry," Tobias said. "No," she agreed, "but it gets very tiring carrying it." They walked back to the house in the dark together, close enough that their arms brushed once and neither of them stepped away from it, and Tobias felt the warmth of her through his coat sleeve and told himself it was just the cold making him notice things. He was, as has been established, a careful man. But care has its limits, and this is what careful men learn when they least expect it. It was 12 days after Rebecca came to the Sullivan homestead that Tobias's neighbor, Caleb Dre, rode over with news. Caleb was 61 and had been in this part of Montana since before the territory existed, and he knew everything that moved through the county the way a man knows his own property, by feel and by long familiarity. He dismounted in the yard and accepted the coffee Tobias brought out and spoke in the low, direct way of a man who has never felt the need to soften a fact. "Vane has been talking in town," Caleb said. telling people the woman he brought up from Missouri has gone missing and he is worried for her safety, making himself out to be a concerned party. But the way he is talking about it, Sullivan, it does not sound like concern. It sounds like property. She is not property, Tobias said. Caleb looked at him sideways. No, she is not. Does she want to stay? Tobias thought about the question. It was a fair one. He had not asked it directly and she had not answered it directly, and perhaps it was time for that conversation to happen. I believe so, he said. I have not pressed the matter. Well, Caleb said, wrapping both hands around the mug and looking out at the mountains. The thing is, Vane has been talking to Judge Hale. And Hale is not the man Aldane is. Hale has been known to stretch a ruling in Vane's direction when the motivation is sufficient. What kind of ruling? Tobias asked. His voice was level, but something in him had gone tight. Vane claims he brought her up here at considerable expense on the understanding that she would marry him. He is talking about seeking some kind of recovery of costs, maybe trying to bring her back on those grounds. Caleb shook his head. It will not hold in a real court, but out here, a judge with enough motivation can cause a woman a great deal of trouble before it gets to a real court. Tobias said nothing for a moment. He was thinking, and when he thought he went very still and very quiet, and Caleb, who had known him for years, waited. All right, Tobias said at last. Thank you, Caleb. Caleb put the mug down on the porch rail and swung back up into the saddle. For what it is worth, he said, looking down at Tobias with eyes that had seen a great many things and missed very few of them, I think she is a good woman. And I think you are an idiot if you let Vane run her off your land. He rode away and left Tobias standing on the porch with that thought. That evening, after supper, Tobias sat down at the table and Rebecca sat across from him, and he told her what Caleb had said. He told her plainly, all of it, without softening the parts that were hard. She listened with her hands folded on the table and her face very composed, and when he was finished she was quiet for long enough that the fire in the main room crackled twice. I will leave, she said. I will not bring this down on you. You will not leave, he said. She looked at him. Tobias. You will not leave, he said again, and there was something in his voice that was not stubbornness but was close to it, close enough that the difference did not matter. I am not going to put you out on the road because Howard Vane is a bully with a flexible judge. That is not something I am going to do. You did not ask for this, she said. No, he agreed. I did not, but here we are. She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment the fire threw a warm, unsteady light across her face, across the green of her eyes, and Tobias Sullivan, who had not allowed himself to want anything that was not firmly within his grasp and clearly within his right to have, felt something move in him that was going to be very difficult to put back. Why? She said, not demanding, not pressing, just asking, the simple question of a person who wants to understand. Because you are worth helping, he said, and then because he was a man who valued precision, and because I do not want you to go. Rebecca Norris looked at him across the table for a very long time. Then she said quietly, I do not want to go. And that, in the way of things that are true and simply stated, settled something between them. They did not speak of it further that night, but the air in the house had changed, and both of them knew it had changed, and neither of them pretended otherwise. What followed was 2 weeks of something that Tobias had no prior experience of and therefore had no efficient way to process. He was aware of her constantly, the way you are aware of something that has changed in a room you know very well, not in an unsettling way, but in a way that makes the room more itself, more complete. He found reasons to come back to the house during the day that he had not found before. She found reasons to come out to the yard. They talked easily now, about everything and about nothing, and the talking had the quality of something that was building toward something else, and both of them knew it, and neither of them rushed it. She helped him move the last of the cattle into the closer pasture for winter, and she turned out to be a capable hand with the horses, better than he had expected. And when he said so, she told him that her uncle had kept horses in Missouri, and she had learned young. She sat a horse with the natural ease of someone who had come to it early and stayed with it, and Tobias watched her ride along the fence line in the clear, cold air, and felt a kind of admiration that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with her. One afternoon, 3 weeks after she had arrived, they were both in the barn doing the evening chores when one of the horses, a big chestnut mare named Sunday, decided she had had enough of being brushed and sidestepped with enough force to catch Rebecca off balance. Tobias moved without thinking, catching her by the arm, steadying her, and for a moment she was very close to him in the dim warmth of the barn, close enough that he could see every shade in her green eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of her. She looked up at him and did not step away. He did not step away either. "Thank you," she said, very softly. "Sunday does that sometimes," he said, which was not the thing he wanted to say, but he was being careful. Rebecca Norris looked at him with those clear green eyes and said, "You are always so careful." "It is generally wise to be," he said. "And if being careful is the thing keeping you from something worth having?" she asked. Tobias was quiet for a moment. The barn around them was warm and dim, smelling of hay and horses and the leather of the tack he had been oiling, and Sunday had settled and was looking at both of them with the mild disinterest of a horse who has already forgotten she was ever involved. "Then," he said slowly, "a man might reconsider his position." She smiled then, fully and properly for the first time, and it transformed her face in a way that he felt in his chest like a key turning in a lock that had been shut for a very long time. He took her hand, which was right there in his because he had been holding her arm when she stumbled, and he held it properly now, not steadying her but holding her, and she let him. They stood in the barn and held hands and looked at each other, and it was absolutely not enough, and both of them knew it, and yet both of them were, despite everything, smiling. "Come on," he said. "It is cold and supper will not make itself." "Actually," she said, "supper very nearly does make itself. I put a pot on before I came out. Then we should go make sure it has not burned," he said. She laughed, which was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere genuine and warm, and he thought he would do a great many foolish things if it meant hearing it again. They walked back to the house hand in hand and did not comment on it. The next morning, Tobias rode into Beaumont Creek. The town was the nearest thing to civilization this part of Montana had to offer, which in 1874 meant a main street with a general store, a saloon, a bank, a sheriff's office, a church that was also used as a school on weekday mornings, and a scattering of other establishments that served the ranching community. It had a population of roughly 300 people in town, and several hundred more spread across the surrounding ranches, and it ran on the economy of cattle and the social life of a place where everyone knew everyone, and most of what passed for news was passed over a fence or a counter. Tobias tied his horse at the rail in front of the sheriff's office and went in. Jim Alding was behind his desk with a cup of coffee and a report he was clearly glad to have an excuse to put down. He was 52, built like a barrel with legs, with a gray mustache and the calm, steady eyes of a man who had seen enough human behavior to be unsurprised by almost any of it. He and Tobias had known each other for 8 years and respected each other in the particular way of two men who have never found cause for complaint. "Sullivan," Alding said. "I need to talk to you about Howard Vane," Tobias said. Alding set down his coffee cup. "I had a feeling," he said. "Sit down." Tobias sat down and laid out the situation plainly: Rebecca's arrival, her circumstances, what Caleb had told him about Vane's activities, and his conversations with Judge Hale. Alding listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things Tobias respected about him. When Tobias was finished, Alding was quiet for a moment. "The woman, Miss Norris, she went a Vane of her own free will originally, under a marriage arrangement." "She did," Tobias said. "She was misled about the nature of the man she was coming to, and she has left of her own free will. She has." "Has she been harmed?" "You said the face when she arrived." "There was bruising," Tobias said. "A split lip. She had been struck." Alding's expression did not change, but something behind it hardened slightly. "That is assault," he said. Whatever Vane thinks he is owed, that is assault. I know, Tobias said. I am telling you because I want you to know officially that Miss Norris is at the Sullivan homestead as my guest, of her own free will, and that she does not wish to return to Vane. Whatever Hale might do or say, I want that on record in your office. Hale does not have jurisdiction over where a woman chooses to reside, Alding said evenly. And if Vane comes to me talking about costs and obligations, I am going to tell him that the law does not sell people, and that is the end of that conversation. He looked at Tobias steadily. But Sullivan, I should tell you Vane is angry. Really angry, not just the bluster kind. You are going to want to be watchful. I am always watchful, Tobias said. He rode back home. He told Rebecca what Alding had said, and she listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug and her eyes very steady. He is a good man, she said. The sheriff. He is, Tobias agreed. You are safe here, Rebecca. Whatever Vane tries, it is not going to hold. She looked at him across the kitchen table, and the morning light came through the window behind her and turned her hair to something warmer than auburn, and she said, You have done more for me than anyone had any reason to do. I had reason, he said. What reason? He looked at her for a long moment. I think you know the reason, he said. The color that came into her cheeks then was not from the cold. November arrived, and with it the real cold, the kind that settled into the ground and did not leave until April. The world outside narrowed to the immediate, the barn, the house, the yard, the wood pile, the cattle in their close pasture. The mountains disappeared behind gray sky for days at a time and then reappeared, white-topped now, more severe, more beautiful. Tobias and Rebecca lived in the warmth of the house and the routine of the ranch and the growing, insistent warmth of what was building between them. And it was the kind of winter that a person remembers for the rest of their life, not for any single dramatic event, but for the accumulation of ordinary moments that turned out to be extraordinary. He told her about the land, about every acre of it and what it meant to him. She listened with real interest, asking questions that showed she understood what he was saying and wanted to understand more. She told him about Missouri, about the students she had loved, the small triumphs of a life lived at a teacher's salary in a house that was never quite warm enough. He laughed at her stories about the Mercer twins, who were apparently the most determinedly inattentive students in the history of American education. And she laughed at the story he told about the time he had accidentally built the chicken coop backward, and not noticed until all the chickens were already in it and clearly planning to stay. They cooked together in the evenings. This turned out to be a significant development, because the kitchen was not large and two people cooking in it were required to move around each other frequently. And moving around each other frequently had certain consequences that neither of them was unhappy about. There was a great deal of her reaching past him and him turning at the same moment and small collisions of elbows and arms, and each one of these was noted and stored, and added to the growing account of reasons that this situation was going to require resolution. The resolution came on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, when the snow was falling outside in the quiet, steady way it falls when it means business, and they had made a supper of beef stew that had been on the stove all day and bread that Rebecca had baked that morning, and they were washing the dishes together side by side at the basin, and Tobias had been watching the profile of her face for 10 minutes without being aware that he was doing it, and she turned and caught him at it. She did not look away. He set down the dish he was holding and turned to face her properly, and he said, I need to say something. All right, she said. I know it has not been long, he said. And I know that you came here under difficult circumstances, and that I am the first person who was kind to you in this part of the world, and I have considered the possibility that what I am feeling is simply the result of proximity and circumstance and might not be what I think it is. And, she said, and I have decided, he said, that I do not care. Because regardless of its origin, what I feel is real, and it is substantial, and it concerns you specifically, and I would very much like to know if you feel anything similar. Rebecca Norris looked at him with those clear green eyes and said, "Tobias, I have been wanting you to say something like that for 2 weeks." He laughed just once, a short surprised sound, and then he did the thing he had been not doing for 2 weeks, which was to take her face gently in both hands, careful of the bruise that had faded now to almost nothing, and kiss her. She kissed him back without any hesitation at all, and the snow fell outside and the stove ticked in the silence, and it was exactly as it should be, which is to say it was very simple and very warm and very right. When they stopped, she had her hands on his chest and he had his arms around her, and neither of them was in a hurry to change that. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and he felt her exhale, long and slow, the kind of exhale that lets out something that has been held too long. "I did not expect this," she said. "When I left Missouri, I was not expecting this." "I was not expecting you," he said into her hair. "But I am very glad you came to the fence line." She laughed against his shoulder, and it was the warmth and the laugh together that made him hold her tighter. Howard Vane did not disappear quietly. He came back to the Sullivan homestead 10 days later, in early December, and this time he came alone, which was in some ways more concerning than coming with men. Alone meant he was either very confident or very angry, and from what Tobias knew of him, those two things were not mutually exclusive. Tobias came out of the house when he heard the horse, and Rebecca stayed inside as they had discussed if this moment came. He stood on the porch with his thumbs in his belt and his expression composed and waited. Vane dismounted. He did not tie the horse. He came to the foot of the porch steps and stood with his hat in his hand, which might have seemed like a conciliatory gesture except for the look on his face, which was not conciliatory at all. "I know she is here," Vane said. His voice was controlled, which Tobias had been told meant he was angrier than usual. "I know you have been keeping her here, and I want you to understand, Sullivan, that what you are doing is an interference in a private business arrangement." "There is no business arrangement," Tobias said. "A woman is not a business arrangement." "She came to me under contract," Vane said. "I paid her passage, I paid Purdy's fee. There are costs involved." "Then take it up with Purdy," Tobias said. "Miss Norris did not sign a contract. She answered an advertisement for a potential husband. She met you and found you wanting. She left. That is her right." Vane's jaw tightened. "She does not have a right to cost me money and walk away." "She has every right," Tobias said. "And I will tell you plainly, Vane, I have spoken to Jim Alden. He knows she is here. He knows she is here of her own will. He also knows about the state of her face when she arrived. Any action you take is going to be seen through that lens." Vane was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face that was calculation running up against a wall. "You want her," he said. It was not a question. It was said with the contempt of a man who has discovered an opponent's vulnerability and considers it a weakness. "I want her to be safe," Tobias said. "Whatever else is between Miss Norris and myself is not your concern." "It is my concern when my money went toward bringing her here," Vane said. "Then sue Purdy," Tobias said. "But come onto this property again making claims on a free woman, and I will have Alden out here so fast you will not have time to think of a story." The two men looked at each other across the cold December air, and Tobias held his ground without effort because his ground was, in fact, solid legally, morally, and in every other way that mattered. Vane put his hat back on. He turned and mounted his horse with the careful dignity of a man who refuses to let anyone see that he has lost something, and he rode away without another word. Tobias stood on the porch until the sound of the horse faded and then went inside, where Rebecca was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her color high. "I heard," she said. "Good," he said. "Then I do not need to repeat it." She came to him and pressed her forehead briefly against his jaw, which was something she had started doing in the past week, a small gesture that was entirely hers, and he put his hand at the back of her head and held her there for a moment. "Is it over?" she asked. "I think so," he said. Vane is not a man who risks public embarrassment when he can see the way a thing is going. He is going to cut his losses. He was right about that, as it turned out. Vane made no further approaches to the Sullivan homestead. He tried, according to Caleb Dre, who heard it from the barber who heard it from Vane's own foreman, to get Judge Hale to issue some kind of civil order. But Hale was not foolish enough to try that with Alden on the opposing side and the facts as they were, and the matter was quietly dropped. Vane moved on to other grievances, as men like him always do, and Rebecca Norris stopped watching over her shoulder every time she stepped outside. The freedom of that, the simple physical ease of not being afraid, arrived gradually over the following weeks, and Tobias watched her unfold in it the way a flower unfolds in warm light, not all at once, but surely and beautifully, becoming more herself with every day. She was funny. He had not quite predicted that. She had a dry, precise sense of humor that came out sideways when she was comfortable, and it fit perfectly against his own, which ran along similar lines, and they could make each other laugh with very little effort, which is, when you think about it, one of the most important things two people can do. She was also stubborn, which he had known from the beginning. She had opinions about things and was not shy about them, and she thought he was wrong about at least half of what he believed concerning the proper way to season cast iron, the relative merits of different breeds of cattle, and the correct approach to managing a household budget. She was right about approximately none of these things in his view. He told her so. She told him he was obstinate. He agreed and said it had served him well. She said there was a difference between useful stubbornness and foolish stubbornness. He asked her to define the line. She told him he was standing on it. They argued about it happily for 20 minutes, and then she made him try the cast iron her way, and he admitted, privately and without saying so aloud, that the steak was better. She noticed he had gone quiet on the subject and gave him a look of supreme satisfaction that he pretended not to see. Christmas came and went quietly. Just the two of them and a dinner that was extravagant by homestead standards, a proper roast and dried apple pie that Rebecca produced from ingredients that Tobias thought he had for entirely different purposes. And they sat at the table in the lamplight and ate and talked, and somewhere in the middle of it Tobias realized that he was happier than he had been in as long as he could remember, possibly happier than he had been in his adult life. And the realization landed with the quiet certainty of something that has been true for a while, but is only just now being stated. He looked at her across the table. "What?" said, because she could read his face now in the way that people can read a face they have been paying close attention to. "Nothing," he said. "You have an expression," she said. "I have several expressions," he said. "You will have to be more specific." "The one where you have thought something important and are trying to decide whether to say it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly, whatever the honest answer is." She set down her fork. "All right. Are you happy here?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the roof the way it does in Montana winter, a low, sweeping sound that is somehow more of a presence than an absence. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." "And is it the house that makes you happy, being settled somewhere safe? Because if it is that, I need to know." Rebecca Norris looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and said, "If someone came to me tomorrow and offered me a house twice this size and twice as warm and twice as safe, and you were not in it, I would not want it." Tobias Sullivan, who was not a man given to visible emotion, felt something in his chest that was almost painful in how warm it was. "Good," he said. "Because I intend to ask you to marry me. I was going to ask in a more considered way with more preparation, but since we are being honest tonight, I am asking." Rebecca's expression did something complicated and lovely. "You are asking," she said. "I am asking." "You could ask properly," she said, "with a question." He stood up from the table and came around to her side of it, and he went down on one knee beside her chair, the way a man is supposed to when it matters, and he took both her hands in his and he said, "Rebecca Norris, I did not plan any of this. I did not plan you, and I did not plan what happened when you came to the fence line, and I could not have imagined that I would be here asking this. But I am asking because I love you, and I want you here not as a guest and not because you need somewhere to be, but because this is your home and I am your home and you are mine. Will you marry me?" She was crying just a little, the clean, quick tears of happiness rather than anything sad, and she said, "Yes, of course yes," and she laughed through it. "Get up, Tobias, it is a stone floor." He got up and she stood with him and he held her, and the lamp burned warm on the table between the plates of Christmas dinner, and it was the best moment of his adult life. And he knew it was the best moment, which is the greatest luxury a person can have. They were married in February of 1875, in the church in Beaumont Creek on a Saturday morning when the sky was a brilliant, uncompromising blue and the snow on the mountains burned white in the sun. Caleb Dre stood up for Tobias, leaning on his bad knee and grinning the whole time. A woman named Ellen Park, who kept the general store and had taken an immediate liking to Rebecca in the months since they had met in town, stood with Rebecca. Sheriff Aldane sat in the front pew with his wife and looked as satisfied as a man can look who has never been involved in something, but is well aware that his role at the beginning was not nothing. The minister was a spare, serious man named Reverend Cross, who had been performing weddings in this territory for 15 years and had seen all kinds, and who looked at the two people standing before him and recognized what he was looking at, which was two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of all the reasons not to, which is the only real kind of choosing. Tobias held Rebecca's hands and said his vows in a voice that did not waver and meant every word with the whole weight of who he was. Rebecca looked at him while she said hers, and the green of her eyes in the winter light of the church was something Tobias thought he would remember exactly until the last day of his life. They rode back to the homestead as Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, in a wagon that Tobias had fitted with blankets against the cold, and Rebecca sat beside him with her shoulder pressed against his and her gloved hand in his gloved hand, and the land rolled around them white and open and enormous, and it was theirs. The spring came the way spring comes in Montana, not gently but with conviction, a sudden assault of warmth and melt and mud, and then the grass coming in green and fierce, and the mountains shaking off their white in long, slow avalanches that you could watch from the porch in the evening. Rebecca planted a kitchen garden in the corner of the yard that got the best light, and she was serious about it in the way she was serious about everything she cared about, consulting the almanac and testing the soil and making Tobias move the fence 3 times until the dimensions satisfied her. He moved the fence a 4th time without being asked, because he had misjudged the corner post, and she came out to see it and said nothing except to give him a look that contained both acknowledgment and amusement in equal parts, and he thought for the 10,000th time that she was the most interesting person he had ever known. Her garden produced magnificently that first summer, as if the ground had been waiting for someone to take it seriously, and the kitchen in the Sullivan homestead smelled different from June onward of fresh herbs and tomatoes, and the particular green sharp smell of plants doing exactly what they are supposed to do. Caleb Dre came for supper twice a month, which had become a standing arrangement, and he sat at their table and ate prodigiously and talked about everything he knew, which was a great deal, and Rebecca matched him for conversation in a way that delighted him. "Where did you find this woman?" he asked Tobias once, in the blunt way of a man who considers directness a virtue. "She found me," Tobias said. "Lucky," Caleb said, and helped himself to more of the bread. In August, Rebecca told Tobias she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the matter-of-fact directness that was entirely characteristic of her. She waited until he had his coffee and was seated, and then she sat down across from him and said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." Tobias set down his coffee. He looked at her for a long moment, and Rebecca looked back, watching his face in the careful way she had when she was reading him. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing that came out because it was the first thing he wanted to know. "Perfectly," she said. "I feel fine." Tired in the evenings, but fine. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and looked at her, and the look was everything he wanted to say and did not have immediate words for the gratitude and the joy and the slight terror that accompanies any enormous thing that is real. "Tobias," she said with a small smile, "you are allowed to be happy about it." "I am," he said. "I am so happy I cannot sort out how to say it." She squeezed his hand. "Then do not say it," she said. "I can see it." They wrote to Rebecca's sister in Kansas City. She had a younger sister named Clara, and they had exchanged letters since Rebecca arrived in Montana, and Clara had written with warm approval of everything Rebecca had described, especially of Tobias, and Rebecca had told Tobias that Clara said he sounded like exactly the sort of man she had always hoped would come along. Tobias had found this affecting in a way he did not fully articulate. The pregnancy went smoothly through the autumn and into the winter of 1875, and Tobias was, by any objective measure, insufferably attentive. He rearranged the kitchen so that the heaviest things were at waist height. He chopped enough wood by October to last through February. He rode into town for supplies more often than was strictly necessary, and Ellen Park at the general store began to recognize the particular look on his face when he came in, which was the look of a man consulting a mental list that had been made by his wife, and that he was determined not to get wrong. Rebecca told him he was hovering. He said he was not hovering, he was being thorough. She said those were the same thing in this case. He conceded the point and hovered anyway. Their son was born on the 14th of March, 1876, in the back bedroom of the Sullivan homestead, with the help of the doctor from Beaumont Creek and Ellen Park, who had come as promised when Rebecca's time came. It was a long night and a hard one, and Tobias spent most of it in the kitchen trying to be useful and finding that there was nothing useful for him to do, which was the most difficult thing he had experienced in some time. When the doctor came out and told him it was done and they were both well, Tobias had to sit down for a moment before he could stand back up. He went in to her, and she was exhausted and radiant in the way that is particular to women who have done a very large thing and know it, and she was holding a small, red-faced, furiously alive person who was making his opinions about the world known at volume. "Come here," Rebecca said. He came and sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and Tobias Sullivan, who had built his life on the principle that care was the best armor, held his son and felt something in him that had no armor at all against it. "He looks angry," he said. "He is new," Rebecca said. "He has opinions about it." "Fair enough," Tobias said. They named him James after no one in particular. They had simply liked the name, which seemed like a good enough reason. James Sullivan made his presence felt from the beginning. He was loud and strong-willed and had his mother's green eyes and his father's stubbornness, and the combination was, everyone agreed, going to be interesting. Caleb Dray came to see the baby 2 days after he was born and stood in the kitchen doorway holding his hat and looking at James with an expression that was gruff and entirely undone at once, and he said, "Well, he is a fine boy," in the voice of a man who is working hard not to let on how moved he is. "He is," Tobias agreed. "Your father would have been pleased," Caleb said, and then looked as if he immediately regretted saying it because he knew Tobias's feelings about his father. But Tobias thought about it for a moment and said, "Perhaps, though I expect he would have been more pleased by the land since land was the only thing he truly cared about." He paused. "I find I care about different things." Caleb looked at Rebecca, who was sitting in the chair by the window with a cup of tea and James in her arms, her hair loose in the afternoon light, and then back at Tobias. "Yes," Caleb said, "I can see that." The spring of 1876 was warm and early, and the Sullivan homestead went into it with a child's voice in the mornings, and a garden that Rebecca planned from her chair by the window while she was still regaining her strength, and Tobias planting what she told him to plant where she told him to plant it, and getting it right on the first try for once because he had finally accepted that she knew more about gardens than he did. He expanded the cattle herd that spring, adding 20 head from a rancher 2 counties over who was moving his operation north, and the land that had been his father's promise, and then his own hard labor became something else again. A real ranch, a working operation, with enough productivity to be solid and enough room to grow. He hired a hand named Levi Hatch, a quiet man of 25 who was good with horses and cattle, and asked no unnecessary questions. And Levi built himself a small bunkhouse at the north edge of the property, and became part of the fabric of the place without disrupting it, which is the best thing a ranch hand can do. Rebecca went back to teaching in September of that year, which surprised people and did not surprise Tobias at all. The church in Beaumont Creek doubled as a school during the week, and the previous schoolteacher had left in May to go east to be married, and Rebecca had heard about it and come home one evening and told Tobias she wanted to apply. "Then apply," he said. "You do not mind?" she asked. He looked at her. "Why would I mind?" "Some men mind," she said carefully. "I am not some men," he said. "You are a teacher. Teaching is something you love. Of course you should do it." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was warm and direct and slightly exasperated all at once. "You know," she said, "you make it very difficult to find anything to argue about." "I am sure you will manage," he said. She laughed and went and applied, and she was given the position immediately on the basis of her experience and the strong recommendation of Ellen Park, who sat on the school board and was not shy about making her opinions known. So the shape of their life settled into something full and various. Tobias on the ranch with Levi, expanding and tending, always working, always building. Rebecca teaching 3 days a week and tending the homestead the other 2. James growing at the rate that babies grow, which is to say at an alarming rate that constantly surprised his father, who would turn around and find that his son had somehow gotten taller and more opinionated while Tobias was looking the other way. Caleb Dre remained a fixture of their monthly life, and his health was not what it had been, and both Tobias and Rebecca noticed it without saying it directly. He ate less and moved more slowly, and in the evenings his stories sometimes slipped in time, moving from the present to 30 years past without announcement. But he was happy, in the way of a man who has been given good company in his old age, which is the best gift anyone can receive. In the spring of 1878, Caleb died quietly in his own house on a Wednesday morning, and it was Levi who found him when he went to check after 2 days of not seeing smoke from the chimney. He had died in his chair by the fire, which was a decent way to go, and he had left his property 240 acres of good grazing land to Tobias Sullivan in a will that had been properly drawn up in town 2 years before, witnessed by Aldane himself. Tobias stood in Caleb's house and looked at the will and felt the particular grief of losing someone who has been a steady, good presence in your life for a long time. And then he felt something else too, which was gratitude, enormous and quiet, for the gift that had been given. He told Rebecca that evening and she cried, which she had been doing privately since Levi brought the news but had not done in front of Tobias because she knew he needed to feel it his own way first. She cried and he held her and they talked about Caleb for a long time, the stories and the suppers and the gruffness that was never gruffness at all, and they gave him the memorial that a person deserves, which is to be remembered precisely and with love. They buried him on his own land, on a ridge that looked out at the mountains, and every person in Beaumont Creek who had known him came, and several who had not but who understood that a man like that was worth honoring regardless. The Dre land became Sullivan land, formally and properly, and the Sullivan Ranch became one of the larger operations in that part of Montana. Not the largest vein still held that distinction, though his operation had contracted somewhat in the years since the situation with Rebecca, partly because men with tempers make bad decisions, and partly because the market had been unkind to him twice running. But the Sullivan Ranch was solid and growing, and it carried the name with the kind of quiet dignity that Caleb would have approved of. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret, after Rebecca's mother was born in the summer of 1879. She arrived with red gold hair and her father's dark eyes, which was a combination that stopped people in the street for a moment when they looked at her. And she was from the beginning absolutely certain of her own importance, which James deeply resented until he was old enough to recognize it as a trait he also possessed. Margaret was born into a household that was full and warm and loud with the business of living, and she fit into it as if she had always been expected. That autumn, Clara, Rebecca's younger sister, came west from Kansas City for a visit that turned into 3 months, because the West was not what Clara had imagined, and she found she did not want to leave it. She was 23, with her sister's directness and a laugh that could be heard across the yard, and she and Levi Hatch spent a great deal of time finding reasons to be in the same general area and not very much time explaining why. Tobias noticed. Rebecca noticed. They said nothing to each other about it until one evening when Clara and Levi had gone to the barn on some errand that was probably not an errand, and Rebecca looked at Tobias across the kitchen table with a composed expression that was doing a great deal of work. "Should we say something?" she asked. "About what?" Tobias said. She looked at him. "No," he said. "They are grown people making their own choices. The best thing we can do is stay out of it." "You are right," Rebecca said. "I know," he said. "You do not have to sound so pleased about it," she said. "I am pleased about approximately everything," he said. "I believe I have earned the right." She smiled at him across the table with those green eyes, and the lamplight was warm on her face. And he thought, not for the first time or the last, that the woman who had come to the edge of his land that cold October morning had brought with her something he had not known he was missing until it arrived. Clara and Levi were married the following May, in the same church in Beaumont Creek where Tobias and Rebecca had married, and Levi built a proper house on the northern edge of the Sullivan property, on what had been Caleb's land, and Clara began working at the school with Rebecca 2 days a week because there were more children in the area now, and 2 teachers were better than 1. Beaumont Creek itself was growing. The railroad had extended a spur line 30 miles south of town in 1878, and while it had not arrived in town proper, its presence nearby had accelerated the commerce and the population of the region in the way that proximity to a rail line always does. New families arrived through 1879 and 1880. A second saloon opened, which the Reverend Cross opposed and then quietly accepted. A proper doctor established a practice rather than a visiting one. A bank that was not subject to Vane's influence arrived from Billings and set up on the main street next to the general store. Howard Vane himself was less visible in these years. He was still present, still operating his cattle company, but something had gone out of him, or perhaps something had simply settled. He had married a woman from Denver in 1877, a composed, quiet woman named Margaret Ives, the same name, by coincidence, as the Sullivan's daughter, and the marriage seemed to have calmed him in the way that some marriages do, not by improving the person's character, but by absorbing the worst of their energy. He and Tobias passed each other in town occasionally and exchanged the bare minimum of civil acknowledgment and left it there, which was sufficient. The boundary dispute that had simmered between them for years was resolved formally in 1879, when the county surveyor came out and ran the lines properly and found, as Tobias had always maintained, that the disputed strip of eastern pasture belonged to Sullivan land. Vane did not contest it. That was, more or less, the end of any direct conflict between them, and Tobias was glad to let it end. The 1880s brought more weather, more work, more children at Rebecca's school, more cattle on Sullivan land, and the particular satisfaction of watching something you have built become what it was always supposed to be. James Sullivan at 6 was already following his father around the ranch with the intense concentration of someone taking detailed notes, and his father let him, because there was no better way to learn something than to be beside someone who already knew it. In the evenings, Tobias would find Rebecca at the table with her students' papers spread before her, marking in her careful, clear hand, and James would be in the chair by the fire with a book. And Margaret would be asleep already in the back room, where she slept with the ferocious completeness of very young children. And the house was full of the sound and the warmth of all of it. And it was the life that Tobias had not known to want until it came and settled around him like something inevitable. He sat beside Rebecca at the table sometimes in those evenings and read, and she marked, and the fire burned, and the Montana wind moved across the roof overhead, and the silence between them was the richest, fullest silence he had ever known. One evening in November of 1881, with the winter beginning to settle in and James at 7 already opinionated about everything, and Margaret at 2 practicing the word no with extraordinary frequency and dedication, Tobias and Rebecca sat on the porch after the children were in bed. They sat in the cold together, wrapped in separate blankets, and looked at the sky, which was absolutely staggering out here away from any light except their own, a depth of stars that made the world feel both very small and very large simultaneously. "Are you happy?" Rebecca asked him. She asked it in the same way he had asked her that evening years ago, directly and wanting only the true answer. He looked at the sky for a moment. "I am," he said, "more than I know how to tell you." "Tell me anyway," she said. He turned and looked at her, and she was looking back at him in the way she had looked at him from the beginning, clear and direct and without pretense, and he thought about the morning she had appeared at the fence line and the everything that had followed from it, and he said, "When I woke up that morning in October 7 years ago and came down to the pasture and saw you standing there, I thought I was seeing trouble. And I was right, in one sense. You were the most consequential thing that had ever walked onto my land. I am not certain that is a compliment," she said, with the dry precision that he loved. "It is the best compliment I know how to give," he said. "You changed every single thing. You changed what this land means. You changed what this house means. You changed what I mean to myself." He paused. "Before you came, I was building something that was entirely about refusing to be my father, refusing to fail, refusing to leave. You gave me something to build toward, not just away from. That is a very different thing." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out from her blanket and took his hand, which was cold, and held it. "When I was standing at that fence line," she said, "I was the most frightened I had ever been. I had no money and no plan and no idea what was going to happen, and I thought the man who owned this land would simply tell me to move along and I would have to keep walking until I found something." She squeezed his hand. "And then you came down the hill and you did not tell me to move along, and I thought, whatever else happens, this man is decent. I had forgotten what that felt like." "You deserved better than what you got," he said. "I got very much better," she said. "I got you." He brought her hand up and held it between both of his and looked at her in the starlight, and it was as simple and as enormous as it had always been between them. "Come inside," he said. "It is too cold to be philosophical. I think philosophy is best done in the cold," she said. "It keeps you honest." "Then we are very honest," he said, and she laughed, and they went inside together, letting the screen door close behind them with the particular sound it made, the sound of home. The years that followed had their difficulties, as years always do. There were hard winters and a drought in 1883 that cost them a quarter of the cattle, and required the kind of careful management and endurance that tests a family's resources fully. There was a season when James was 9 and was sick with a fever that frightened them both severely for 3 days before it broke, and he came back to himself, furiously demanding to be allowed out of bed. There was the year that the school's roof gave way under a heavy snowfall and needed rebuilding, and Rebecca organized the effort herself with a determination that left the men of Beaumont Creek slightly breathless. But these were the difficulties that belonged to a life fully lived, not the kind that defined the whole of it, and the whole of it was good, and the whole of it was theirs, and they met each difficulty side by side, which is the only way to meet anything. Margaret at 4 decided she wanted to be a doctor, which in 1883 was not a common ambition for a girl child, but was the kind of ambition that her parents looked at and thought, quietly, well, with her determination, perhaps. James at 9 was already breaking horses with his father and learning the business of cattle with a seriousness of purpose that made Levi say, with great respect, that the boy had been born knowing. Clara and Levi's household a quarter-mile north was noisy and warm, and their son, Thomas, born in 1881, was James's closest companion and frequent co-conspirator in a variety of enterprises that their fathers chose to know only enough about to maintain plausible distance from. In the spring of 1885, Rebecca discovered she was expecting again, and told Tobias on a Sunday morning in the kitchen with the same directness she had always had, and he sat across from her and felt the same thing he had felt the first time, the wonder of it, the particular warm terror of caring about something this much. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said, with the small smile that meant she was pleased he asked first. "Good," he said. "You know," she said, "you were supposed to grow out of asking that first every time." "I was never going to grow out of that," he said. Their third child, a boy they named Samuel, arrived in October of 1885, healthy and loud, and James maintained emphatically, already too spoiled by the simple fact of his existence, a complaint that both of his parents recognized as the universal complaint of older siblings everywhere, and treated with the sympathy it deserved, which was approximately none. Samuel Caleb Sullivan, they had given him Caleb as a middle name, which felt right and went without saying, and so they said it arrived in a household that was full of light and history and love, and he grew into it as all the Sullivan children did, strong-willed and curious, and certain that the land around them was the finest place in the world, which was a belief their father had held for long enough that it had become simply fact. Tobias Sullivan stood on his porch on the morning of his 42nd birthday, in October of 1885, and looked out at the land the way he had stood on this same porch 11 years before, and looked out at a woman standing at the fence line. The fence was still there, further out now, moved back twice over the years as the property had expanded. The mountains were the same, absolutely the same, unchanged and unchangeable, which was one of the things Tobias respected about them. The sky was the color it gets in early October in Montana, a blue so sharp it almost stings. Rebecca came out and stood beside him and put a mug of coffee in his hand, and he put his arm around her shoulder, and they stood together in the cold morning air and looked at it all. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I did not know," he said. "When you came to the fence, I did not know what I was letting in." "Is that a complaint?" she said. "It is the furthest thing from a complaint that exists," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and inside the house James was arguing with Margaret about something that had the rhythm of an argument with very deep roots, and Samuel was making his opinions about breakfast known at significant volume, and the sun was clearing the mountains and making the first frost on the grass catch the light and turn it briefly to something that looked like silver. Tobias Sullivan looked at all of it and understood, in the complete and settled way of a man who has spent a long time learning the difference between what he thought he wanted and what he actually needed, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with the person he was supposed to be with, in the life that had arrived for him in the shape of a woman with green eyes and a carpet bag, and the stubbornness to stand at a stranger's fence and not be afraid. He had built this land. And then she had made it home. And that was the whole of it, and the whole of it was more than enough, and it always would be. Inside, James stopped arguing, which meant either that Margaret had won decisively or that something interesting had happened that had distracted them both, and Rebecca straightened up and said, with the brisk certainty of a mother who knows her children, "Someone has spilled something." "Probably," Tobias agreed. "I should go in." "You should," he said. But he held her there another moment, his arm around her shoulder in the cold October air on the porch of the house he had built and she had made real. "Tobias," she said lightly. "One more minute," he said. She laughed quietly and let him have it. One more minute on the porch of the house where they had built their life together, in the Montana morning, with the mountains and the sky and the frost on the grass, and the sound of their children inside, and the whole of their years together arranged behind them like a country they had crossed hand in hand. Then they went inside together, and the door closed, and the morning went on.